warning. This is... yeah, you'll see after the intro music you all hate. Hi, my name is Sydney. Welcome back to my channel. Before we launch in, today's video is sponsored by Surfshark. So thanks for that, guys. Now, sometimes I'm convinced that we're living in a simulation. Other times I'm more convinced that there are a lot of really stupid people making decisions for all of us. Either way, it's not good. So I assembled all of you here today to discuss an issue that flies under the radar. And that's mainly because I don't think there's been one specific case that's blown up in the mainstream media. At least not in any significant way. So the story we're about to discuss was reported back in 2018, but has had some developments as of October-November of 2019. And it's all in Swedish. So that's helpful. Swedish murderer Christopher Johansson, who killed and dismembered his ex-girlfriend, is to be transferred to women's prison. Oh, this is one of those kind of videos. Well, they had a good run. Time to build the wall around Sweden. A weapons enthusiast who viciously murdered and dismembered his ex-girlfriend before feigning concern for her welfare during the search has now been granted a transfer to a women's prison. Christopher Johansson, then aged 23, stabbed to death 20-year-old civil engineering student, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that because I will butcher it, his ex-girlfriend in May 2013. He chopped up her body and scattered the parts throughout the forest and a deserted farm. He also slaughtered and chopped up his dog. Jokes aside for a second, I am actually sorry about how graphic this is. Mr. Johansson was initially sentenced to 14 years in prison. On appeal, the conviction was changed to manslaughter and the sentence was reduced to 10 years. I mean, side note for a second, I have actually never understood how 14 years, let alone 10 years, is an appropriate sentence for premeditated, vicious, horrible murder. Or any murder. Or even animal cruelty. What is this? To be sure, the system is a joke. Someone call the police. We have a stupid. Johansson was sentenced in 2014, and by 2018, he said he was transitioning to female and renamed himself Kim Marie. A Swedish documentary called In the Head of a Killer, which I'm sure sounds much sexier in Swedish than it does in English, was released in October 2018 and talks about Johansson's crime. During this interview, Johansson claims that he's felt like a girl since the age of 5. He also talks about how he uses hormone patches for estrogen, takes testosterone blockers for testosterone, and has been going through the sex correction process. Also, special thank you to all the humans who helped me translate the Swedish into English for this video. Because I don't speak Bork. Bork, bork, bork. I mean, I'm actually not even kidding here. When I listen to this, all I hear is the Swedish chef from the Muppets. Johansson was also granted permission to visit Anova in Stockholm, which provides hormone treatment support and therapy for transgender patients. He also applied to be transferred to a female facility because he felt bullied, harassed, and threatened by inmates at his existing prison. They think that he is devious and a tattle fag. Sweden, when we're done building that wall around you, we're gonna need to have a conversation about your insults because what is this? Anyway, in 2018, that transfer request was denied. Yay for common sense! A new transfer application submitted October 2019 was granted last week. Wait, no. On Monday, Mr. Johansson was transferred to Sweden's largest women's prison, which is a safety class 2, the highest available for women's prisons. Wait, no, stop! Mr. Johansson can potentially be paroled on January 24, 2020, after spending only 6 years in prison. Alright, that is it. Turn the car around, we're going home. I mean, according to the internet, apparently Swedish female prisons are like a big community where people crochet and do gardening. This is clearly the face of a person who really enjoys gardening. He's got a real green thumb, if you know what I mean. You know, I'm so glad that we're all out here putting so much emphasis on protecting female inmates. But you know where else I like to be protected? On the internet. Which is why today's video is sponsored by Surfshark. Surfshark is a virtual private network, or VPN, that helps protect your private information online. Surfshark VPN has a ton of benefits, including protecting your passwords, photos, and private messages, and allowing you to bypass internet censorship and country restrictions. You know, would have come in handy that one time that Australian telecoms decided to block people from accessing 4chan and Zero Hedge. Uncool. Personally, I really like that Surfshark is simple and easy to use, but it also doesn't slow down my internet, which is something that I've experienced using other VPNs before. I also like that it allows me to access blocked websites, online content, and applications, like 15 different Netflix libraries. Surfshark can also be used on as many devices as you want, so you can share it with your friends and family, which is also something that other VPNs don't offer. Use code Sydney to get a special Black Friday 83% off and an additional 3 months free. Surfshark also offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk when you try it out. So click the link in the description box and make all your dreams come true. Because just remember, as long as you can't be safe in prison or out in the real world, at least you can be safe online. Wow, that got real dark real fast. Now, with relation to Johansson and this entire situation, this seems to be where this story draws to a close. But before we explore this a little bit more, I want to make a couple things clear. Apparently, Johansson has actually had gender reassignment surgeries, although I'm not sure to what extent. You know, not sure if he's had the full... These surgeries were also allegedly paid for by the taxpayer because that's just how the Swedish prison system is structured. It's also very important to understand that a male class 1 prison in Sweden is a much higher security prison than a female class 2 prison in Sweden. So he's basically going to a less secure, less maximum security prison and will probably be in with the general population. Comforting. As with most things in 2019 that are just needlessly complicated, this topic does raise a couple questions about transgender people in prison. The first being, what do we do with people who are transgender who offend? The second, what do we do with prisoners who transition while in prison? And third, who on earth is supposed to pay for all of this? Because in Sweden, and here in the United States as well, apparently it's the taxpayer. Here's Elizabeth Warren's recent take at a CNN town hall.
You criticized the judge's ruling that granted transition-related surgery to a transgender inmate. You said, I don't think it's a good use of taxpayer dollars.
Right.
Do you regret that?
Yep. No, it was a bad answer. And I think it was a bad answer. And I believe that everyone is entitled to medical care. And medical care that they need. And that includes people who are transgender, who it is the time for them to have gender-affirming surgery. I just think that's important.
She says that prisoners are entitled to medical care and, by extension, gender reassignment surgeries. Funded by whom, you ask? You and me, of course. The money tree does exist after all. But this isn't even the first time that this idea has popped up. In August of this year, a federal court ordered that Idaho must pay for a sex offender's transgender surgery. Citing constitutional protections against inflicting cruel and unusual punishments on criminals, a panel of 3 judges on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled on Friday that the state of Idaho must pay for the male-to-female transgender reassignment surgery of an inmate sentenced to 10 years in prison for sexually abusing a 15-year-old boy. I wonder if this is what a lobotomy feels like. And there are cases of this happening all over the United States, including, but not limited to, California, no surprises there, Massachusetts, Illinois, and Connecticut. I've also found examples of this throughout Europe, most notably the UK, but also in New Zealand, and I'm banking Australia. I mean, we put people like this on national TV. Taxpayer-funded gender reassignment is not that surprising at this point. In the very least, it appears that these courts and governments are making these decisions because they view gender reassignment as integral medical care to which prisoners are entitled. There's that word they like so much. Entitled. I mean, color me crazy, but once you hack someone to death, I don't think that you're entitled to a whole lot. Except maybe the chair. Sydney, that is extremely distasteful and very unfunny. So, you're transgender and you're in prison. What now? Well, for starters, corrections institutions must take into consideration a person's gender identity, meaning that corrections agencies are prohibited from placing transgender inmates into men's or women's units solely based on their anatomy at birth. So then, what's it based on? Where do you put the people who say they're neither male nor female? What about people like me who want to be housed with the other unicorns? bigot? So from all of this arises two key arguments from both sides of the aisle. The major concern is changing our prison system to accommodate transgender inmates will put other inmates, particularly women, at risk, especially when you consider the fact that anyone can identify as a woman and then change to a female facility. But the other side argues that transgender inmates are the ones who receive the most amount of abuse behind bars, leading to depression, suicide, and self-harming, meaning that they should receive much more support. For example, a story was reported in 2016 from Brisbane, Australia, alleging that a transgender woman was raped 2,000 times in an all-male prison. Another story from 2017 from Pittsburgh claims the same. There was a third story in Britain in the same year that covered a suicide pact made by transgender inmates who said they'd been bullied and mistreated and took their own lives. But for every case like this, I can find another that talks about a transgender inmate who's assaulted a biologically female inmate. Transgender prisoner sexually assaults 4 female inmates in prison. Transgender inmate is accused of sexual attacks on women in prison. Transgender in prison for raping young girls sexually assaults inmates in women's prison. In this last example, a fellow female inmate said, "The transgender offender may have changed physically, but his brain is still the same. You can change somebody's genitals, but it's not going to take away the urge and impulse inside them to do horrific things to children." In each of these specific cases, I just want to be clear that these people still had penises despite the fact that they identified as female. And then they are put in with biological females in female facilities. So yeah, that's like kind of playing with fire. I'm sorry, that's not just playing with fire. That's burning down the whole house. And the forest behind the house. Seriously, who keeps giving you people matches? So when you start digging into the statistics on this topic, things don't get any clearer. Data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics from 2011 and 2012 said that there were 3,200 transgender inmates in state and federal prisons across the US. Of that number, 101 were surveyed, and around 40% said that they'd been sexually victimized in prison. According to these numbers, that means that transgender inmates are 13 times more likely than non-transgender inmates in the same prisons to experience sexual abuse. But if that's how often they're being victimized, how often are they doing the victimizing? That, my friends, is unclear. Because there are no super clear statistics, not because it doesn't happen. Just FYI. In Britain, at least, according to several reports, and apparently according to the Ministry of Justice itself, almost half of trans prisoners are sex offenders, compared with 19% in the prison population as a whole. Some doctors and prison workers have also alleged that apparently sex criminals will transition to female in order to gain access to female inmates. I just don't really know why anyone would be surprised by this. We're dealing with criminals here. They lie all the time. But honestly, in my trials of the internet, I couldn't really find any definitive numbers telling me how many transgender inmates have assaulted or sexually abused biological female inmates. But that doesn't mean it doesn't happen, it just means I couldn't find stats on it. So what we do know, at least in the British context, is that a huge portion of them are sex offenders. But what we can assume from this point is regrettably speculative. I mean, it is 2019, speculation is apparently fact now. What I did find, however, is that in the UK, 1 in 50 prisoners identifies as transgender, amid concerns inmates are attempting to secure prison perks. According to an annual report by Peter Clark, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, there are up to 1,500 transgender inmates among 90,000 prisoners in England and Wales, more than 10 times previous estimates and at least 4 times the number in the general population. Transgender prisoners are entitled to shower alone, separate cells, and can apply to switch between male and female jails. Earlier this year, the Ministry of Justice created a wing for transgender prisoners to keep them away from other inmates. And I'm sure this will shock none of you, but the majority of these people identifying as transgender are men who now identify as women. So yeah, where does this leave us? Confused, holding some matches, and standing in the flames. That's where this leaves us. Like most things in 2019 that concern the transgender movement, there is a growing worry here that biological men will become the dominant population in women's prisons. Especially when you consider the fact that women are already underrepresented as inmates. And to compound this, the majority of female inmates are in for things like drug offenses and property crimes, not hacking people to pieces. And according to several studies and surveys, 21% of transgender women have spent time in prison or jail compared to only 5% of all US adults. So yeah, there's that. So based on everything I've said here, it's fair to assume that when it comes to the prison system, the majority of transgender people will be men who identify as women, which means that they'll be moved to women's facilities. So at least for me, the major point here is simple. Nobody has yet demonstrated how and if transgender women pose less of a risk to biological female inmates and staff than any other regular biological male criminal. It's probably fair to assume that the majority of people would oppose putting biological male offenders in with biological female offenders, so I guess in this context, it raises the question of why this is appropriate. Does being transgender suddenly change the danger factor to female inmates? Feminist women's groups have even come out and argued that this opens the door for sexual predators of various types, from voyeurs to rapists, to reinvent themselves as female by taking on female names and identities. They say this will make female inmates unsafe, and as we've seen in some of these examples, that's exactly what's happened. Another consideration here is whether or not transgender inmates deserve special treatment at all. Violence and sexual abuse in prison is not uncommon, with some federal reports suggesting 1 in 20 prisoners are raped or sexually abused behind bars. And yet, these men and women aren't subject to special protective measures. So the question here is, does the transgender inmate population warrant extra special protection and measures for their safety? I mean, like, shouldn't all prisoners be treated the same? As with most issues that concern the transgender community, of course there will be inmates who are firstly legitimately transgender, but who also do not pose a risk. But as it stands, we have kicked the door open to allow anyone and everyone to identify as a woman and then be moved to a women's facility. And personally, I just feel like that's hugely problematic for everyone involved. So it seems that in this quest to protect transgender women in male prisons from sexual abuse and general abuse, we are inadvertently putting biological female inmates at risk. And as with most things that I talk about and look into on this channel, I definitely don't have all the answers, and this case is no exception. But what I do feel inherently is that the way that we're going about things is absolutely not correct. So before I open the floor to you, just a reminder that you can download Surfshark VPN with the code in the description. When you enter promo code Sydney, you get a special Black Friday 83% off and 3 months free. Now I open the floor to you. What do you all think? Should the taxpayer be responsible for funding gender reassignment surgeries for criminals? Should biological men who are transgender women be housed with biological women? Do you think all of this is completely insane? And what's the solution here? As always, if you like the video, hit subscribe and the thumbs up button. If you want to leave a comment, feel free to do so. Just be respectful about it. And I will see you guys next time.